Hello there, my Twilight souls. Tonight, we journey into the heart of an extraordinary love story. One that spans centuries and defies the very nature of existence itself. This is the tale of Carlisle and Esme Cullen. Two souls who found each other across the chasm of death and built something unprecedented in the vampire world. A family founded not on power or convenience, but on compassion, choice, and unwavering love. So, before you get cozy, I want to tell you something small and honest. I have this dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers before the month ends. If you've been enjoying these stories and you'd like to help me get there, subscribing would mean so much. Now, let's ease into a peaceful moment together. The transformation happened in 1643. In the filthy darkness of London's sewers, where Carlisle Cullen died as human and woke 3 days later as vampire, his throat burning with thirst that demanded human blood, his body remade into predator designed by nature to hunt the very species he had spent his human life trying to protect. He was 23 years old, the son of an Anglican pastor who had dedicated his life to hunting monsters. And now Carlisle had become the very thing his father would have destroyed without hesitation or mercy. The irony was not lost on him. Even through the agony of transformation, even through the desperate early months when he tried every method he could conceive to end his cursed existence and rejoin the human dead rather than continue as immortal monster. But death proved impossible for his supernatural body, and eventually, starving and delirious in a cave north of London, he discovered that animal blood could sustain him. That he did not have to become murderer to survive as vampire, that perhaps there existed a path between refusing his nature entirely and surrendering to it completely. The discovery changed everything, transformed his curse into something that might be endured, might even serve purpose if he could find a way to use his enhanced abilities for good rather than evil. He began to see possibility where before there had been only despair, began to imagine existence that honored his humanity even as it acknowledged his vampire nature, began to believe that perhaps he could live according to his principles rather than being enslaved by his thirst. The centuries that followed were marked by profound and unrelenting solitude. Isolation so complete and absolute that it became the defining characteristic of his existence, shaping every decision and coloring every experience. Carlisle was alone in ways that went far beyond simple physical isolation, alone in his convictions and his choices, alone in his commitment to protecting human life when every instinct screamed at him to feed, alone in believing that vampires might choose compassion over their predatory nature. He encountered other vampires occasionally during his wanderings across Europe. Brief meetings that only emphasized how different he was, how unusual his vegetarian diet seemed to beings who fed on humans without apparent guilt or moral complication. How his compassion for humanity marked him as weak or deluded in their eyes. Most vampires were nomadic by necessity, traveling constantly to avoid detection, leaving trails of bodies behind them as they fed and moved and fed again. their existence defined by the hunt and the kill and the constant need to hide what they were from human awareness. They found Carlisle's lifestyle incomprehensible, could not understand why he would choose animal blood over the superior satisfaction of human prey, could not fathom why he would limit himself so severely when vampire nature gave him the strength and speed and immortality to take whatever he wanted without consequence or resistance. These encounters were brief and uncomfortable, marked by mutual incomprehension and thinly veiled contempt on both sides, the other vampires dismissing Carlisle as fool who denied his nature, Carlisle viewing them as creatures who had surrendered to their worst impulses and abandoned any claim to morality or conscience. The loneliness was not merely absence of companionship, but profound awareness of being fundamentally different, of existing in category entirely his own, of having no one in the world who understood what it meant to be vampire striving toward humanity, rather than human corrupted into monstrosity. He could not form friendships with humans because his nature required constant vigilance and deception, required him to hide his strength and his speed and his cold skin and his lack of heartbeat, required him to pretend to breathe and eat and age when none of these things were true or necessary. He could not form friendships with other vampires because they did not share his values or his commitment to the vegetarian lifestyle, because they viewed his compassion for humans as weakness rather than strength, because their casual attitude toward human death disturbed him in ways he could not overlook or ignore. In the early 1700s, Carlisle's travels brought him to Italy, to Volterra, where the ancient vampire lords called the Volturi maintained their court and ruled the vampire world through combination of political maneuvering and overwhelming force. Aro, Marcus and Caius had existed for over 3,000 years, had created the laws that governed vampire society, had built civilization of sorts within the supernatural community that existed hidden beneath human awareness. They were sophisticated and educated, surrounded by art and books and culture accumulated over millennia, served by guard of powerful vampires whose supernatural gifts made them nearly invincible in combat or conflict. Carlisle presented himself at their fortress, seeking companionship among his own kind, hoping to find understanding or at least acceptance from vampires old enough and wise enough to appreciate his unusual path. Aro was fascinated by him immediately, reading every thought Carlisle had ever had through single touch, understanding his transformation and his despair, and his discovery of animal blood with completeness that conversation could never achieve. The ancient vampire found Carlisle's vegetarian lifestyle intriguing rather than contemptible, viewing it as interesting experiment rather than moral failure, curious about whether such discipline could be maintained across centuries rather than just decades. The Volturi invited Carlisle to stay in Volterra, to study in their extensive library, to benefit from their accumulated knowledge and experience. He accepted gratefully, desperate for companionship after over half a century of absolute solitude, willing to overlook certain fundamental differences in exchange for intellectual stimulation and the simple comfort of being among others who knew what he was and accepted his presence. He lived with them for 2 decades, engaging in long philosophical discussions with Aro about nature versus choice, about whether supernatural beings were bound by their nature or capable of transcending it, about what morality meant for creatures whose very existence required taking life in some form. But the Volturi fed on humans without hesitation or remorse, viewing humanity as prey species that existed for vampire sustenance, seeing no moral issue with killing to satisfy their nature. The city of Volterra unknowingly supplied them with steady stream of victims, tourists who disappeared in the night and were never found, locals who vanished and were attributed to misfortune rather than supernatural predation. The Volturi maintained careful balance, never taking enough victims to draw serious attention, always covering their tracks, ensuring their existence remained hidden while still satisfying their considerable thirst through regular hunting in their own territory. Carlisle found he could not reconcile himself to their lifestyle despite the companionship they offered, could not accept the casual deaths that occurred regularly in the fortress, could not watch humans being led to slaughter and maintain his own commitment to protecting human life. The philosophical discussions with Aro were stimulating and genuine. The access to art and literature and accumulated wisdom was extraordinary. The simple presence of others who understood the vampire nature was deeply comforting after decades of isolation. But the cost was too high, the compromise too great, the daily confrontation with values fundamentally opposed to his own, too disturbing to endure indefinitely. He left Volterra in the early 1800s, thanking the Volturi for their hospitality, promising to remember them as friends despite their differences, departing for America, where perhaps he might find new purpose and new possibilities in the new world. The departure was bittersweet, relief at escaping the constant moral discomfort mixed with grief at returning to absolute solitude, satisfaction at maintaining his principles mixed with awareness that he was choosing loneliness over companionship because he could not bend his convictions even slightly to accommodate the only other vampires who had shown him acceptance and welcome. America offered fresh start, vast spaces where vampire could move relatively freely, growing cities where skilled physician would be valued and where questions about his unusual characteristics might be attributed to foreign origin rather than supernatural nature. Carlisle established himself in various locations over the decades, always working in medicine, always at night, always maintaining careful distance from the humans he treated, even as he dedicated himself to their care and healing. He studied constantly, his vampire memory allowing him to retain every medical text he read with perfect clarity, his centuries of experience giving him perspective and insight that no human physician could match. The work gave him purpose beyond simple survival, reason to continue existing beyond stubborn refusal to surrender to his nature, meaning to immortal life that otherwise stretched ahead empty and pointless. He saved lives regularly, his enhanced senses allowing him to detect problems other doctors missed, his perfect memory giving him access to centuries of accumulated medical knowledge, his supernatural speed and precision making him extraordinarily skilled surgeon. But purpose was not the same as happiness. Meaning was not the same as fulfillment. And as the decades passed and the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Carlisle became increasingly aware of what his life lacked despite all he had achieved. He was alone, profoundly, completely, absolutely alone in ways that went beyond simple absence of companionship. He had built life of service and dedication, had proven that vampire could exist without becoming evil, had maintained his principles across nearly 2 centuries of temptation and difficulty. But he had no one to share his existence with, no one who truly knew him, no one who understood what it cost to maintain his control day after day across decades that became centuries. He watched humans live and love and build families, watched them find meaning and connections with others, watched them create homes and relationships that gave their brief lives richness his immortal existence lacked. The longing for family grew stronger as time passed, desire that seemed to intensify rather than diminish with each passing year. He began to consider, tentatively and with great reluctance, the possibility of creating companion for himself, of transforming another human into vampire who might share his vegetarian lifestyle and his commitment to protecting human life. The idea repulsed him even as it attracted him. The thought of cursing another person with vampire existence, violating everything he believed about respecting human life and allowing people to choose their own destinies. He had not chosen his transformation, had been attacked and infected against his will, had spent years wishing for death before finding a way to live with what he had become. How could he inflict that same curse on another person deliberately? How could he steal their humanity and their mortality and their chance at normal human life? How could he justify such action, even if his intentions were good, and his loneliness was profound, and his desire for companionship was legitimate and understandable? The internal debate continued for years, Carlisle unable to fully commit to the idea, but also unable to completely dismiss it. The possibility hovering at the edges of his consciousness like ghost he could not quite exorcise. He told himself that if he ever did create companion, it would only be for someone who was dying anyway, someone who would lose their life regardless of his intervention, someone for whom transformation would be gift of continued existence rather than theft of human life they were still living. The rationalization felt weak even to him. Justification constructed to make the unthinkable seem acceptable, but it gave him framework for considering the possibility without completely rejecting his own principles. He would save lives, not steal them. He would offer continued existence to those who would otherwise die, not corrupt the living into monsters. By 1911, Carlisle Cullen had existed as vampire for 268 years, had perfected his control over bloodlust to a degree unprecedented among his kind, had built reputation as skilled physician in whatever community he currently inhabited, had maintained his commitment to protecting human life without single exception across nearly 3 centuries of constant temptation. He had achieved everything he set out to achieve, had proven everything he wanted to prove about vampire nature and moral choice and the possibility of living according to principles that transcended instinct. But he was alone, and the weight of that solitude had become almost unbearable. Awareness of what he lacked sharpening with each passing year into something that felt almost like grief. Mourning for connections he had never had and might never have, for family that existed only in imagination, for companionship that seemed forever beyond his reach. He did not know that everything was about to change, that fate was preparing to bring him exactly what he needed in form he would not expect, that his solitary existence was approaching its end, even as he settled into yet another new city, and yet another hospital position, and yet another performance of the dedicated physician who worked alone and lived alone, and would apparently remain alone for all of eternity. Columbus, Ohio in 1911 was a modest Midwestern city, neither large enough to be overwhelming nor small enough to be confining. The kind of place where people lived ordinary lives marked by ordinary joys and ordinary sorrows, where doctors were valued and respected, where a man with impeccable credentials and willingness to work night shifts could establish himself without excessive scrutiny or suspicion. The streets were lined with trees that turned brilliant colors in autumn. The neighborhoods consisted of modest houses occupied by families who knew their neighbors and attended church on Sundays. The downtown area bustled with commerce and conversation during daylight hours before quieting as evening fell and respectable people returned to their homes. Carlisle had secured position at the local hospital shortly after arriving in the city, his references perfect as always, his skills immediately apparent to administrators desperate for competent physician willing to handle the difficult cases and the inconvenient hours that other doctors avoided when possible. He worked primarily at night, claiming preference for quieter shifts when he could focus on patients without the chaos and administrative demands of daytime hospital operations, when the reduced staff and dimmer lighting meant his unusual characteristics would be less noticeable, when his pale skin and cold hands might be attributed to the cool night air rather than to supernatural nature, he carefully concealed. The excuse was accepted without question because his results were undeniable, his diagnostic accuracy remarkable, his surgical skill beyond anything the other physicians had witnessed in their careers spanning decades of practice. He was Dr. Cullen, the talented and dedicated physician who never seemed tired despite working consecutive shifts, whose pale skin and cold hands were oddities easily overlooked given his obvious competence and genuine care for his patients, whose slight accent suggested European education and explained whatever seemed unusual about his manner or appearance, or the way he moved with precision that seemed almost too perfect to be entirely natural. The local doctor was away visiting family in Cleveland when Esme Ann Platt fell from the tree on her family's property on a warm afternoon in late spring. The 16-year-old girl attempting to climb higher than was wise, reaching for a branch that appeared sturdy but was rotted beneath its healthy-looking bark. The branch broke beneath her weight and sent her plummeting to the ground below, her body falling perhaps 15 feet before impact, no time to position herself or break her fall, simply the sudden sickening sensation of weightlessness, followed by explosive pain as she hit the earth. She landed badly, her left leg taking the full impact, the bone breaking with sound her mother heard from inside the house where she was preparing dinner. The sharp crack followed immediately by Esme's scream, cutting through the peaceful afternoon. The injury was severe, compound fracture with bone piercing through skin, blood soaking into her dress, her leg twisted at angle that made her mother gasp, and her father go pale when he came running from the barn. This was injury that required immediate medical attention beyond what her frightened parents could provide at home with bandages and prayers, and hope that everything would heal properly without professional intervention, or the infection that claimed so many limbs and lives in that era before antibiotics. They brought her to the hospital in the early evening, her father driving the wagon as quickly as he dared over the rutted roads, her mother cradling Esme's head in her lap and trying to keep her still despite the jolting of the vehicle. Carried her into the emergency area where Carlisle was on duty, her face pale with shock and pain, her dress stained with blood and dirt, her leg wrapped in makeshift splint her father had fashioned from broken fence posts and torn strips of sheet. His diagnostic assessment was immediate and certain even before he examined her physically, his enhanced senses telling him everything he needed to know about the severity of her injury and the treatment it required. He could hear her heartbeat elevated from pain and fear, but strong and steady beneath the panic. Could smell the blood from her broken leg where bone had torn through flesh, mingling with the scent of her skin and hair and the fierce sweat that came from trauma and shock. He could sense with his enhanced perception that despite the dramatic nature of the injury and the amount of blood she had lost, she was in no danger of dying if the wound was properly treated and infection prevented through careful cleaning and monitoring over the days and weeks that would follow. He approached her with the gentle manner he had perfected over decades of medical practice, his voice calm and soothing as he introduced himself to both Esme and her parents, his movements deliberate and careful as he examined her leg, his cool hand steady and sure despite the scent of her blood filling his nostrils and making the thirst burn in his throat with intensity he had learned to ignore through sheer force of will and centuries of practice. The burn was manageable, uncomfortable, but not overwhelming. His control absolute after 268 years of resisting temptation, far more powerful than one injured teenage girl could provide. She watched him through her pain, her brown eyes tracking his face with fascination that went beyond simple gratitude for medical care, something in his unusual appearance capturing her attention completely despite her discomfort and fear. He was beautiful in ways that human men were not, his features too perfect, his skin too smooth and pale, his movements too graceful and precise, his golden eyes unlike any color she had ever seen in human face. But there was something else too, something in his gentle manner and genuine concern that seemed to shine through his careful professional distance, warmth that contradicted his cold skin, humanity that persisted despite whatever made him seem so unusual and otherworldly. He set her leg with efficient precision, his supernatural strength allowing him to manipulate the broken bone back into proper alignment with control that human hands could never achieve, his enhanced vision letting him see exactly how the pieces fit together beneath the torn flesh, his perfect knowledge of anatomy accumulated over centuries guiding every movement. He worked quickly but not hastily, taking the time to do everything correctly despite her obvious pain, explaining what he was doing and why in voice that maintained steady calm, even as he caused unavoidable discomfort in the process of repairing the damage. His manner was different from any doctor she had encountered before, different from the Gruff family physician who had treated her childhood illnesses with efficiency but little warmth, different from the dentist who had pulled her infected tooth the previous year without bothering to explain what he was doing or why it was necessary. Dr. Cullen spoke to her not as child to be patronized, but as intelligent person capable of understanding her own medical treatment, respecting her awareness even as he managed her care, including her in the process rather than simply doing things to her while she passively endured. The conversation that developed while he worked revealed her sharp mind and kind nature, her thoughtful questions about bones and healing and how bodies repaired themselves showing genuine curiosity about the world beyond her small-town existence, rather than simple politeness or attempt to distract herself from pain. She asked how long the bone would take to knit back together, whether it would be as strong as before, what she should avoid doing during recovery, whether she would have permanent scar where the bone had pierced through skin. Her questions were intelligent and showed real desire to understand, rather than simply being told what to do and expected to obey without comprehension. He answered each question thoroughly, treating her inquiries with the same respect he would give to adult patient or fellow physician. His explanations clear and detailed without being condescending. His obvious pleasure in her curiosity, making the conversation feel almost like discussion between colleagues rather than doctor treating patient. She told him about her dreams of leaving Columbus someday, of seeing more of the world than the modest streets and familiar faces that defined her current life, of experiencing something larger and more interesting than what her circumstances currently offered. She spoke with the enthusiasm of youth combined with the thoughtfulness of someone older than her 16 years. Her intelligence evident in how she processed information and asked follow-up questions that showed real comprehension rather than simple politeness. Carlisle found himself drawn to her in ways he had not anticipated and did not entirely welcome. Attraction that went beyond her physical appearance to something deeper. Recognition of warmth and vitality and genuine goodness that he had not allowed himself to appreciate in centuries of carefully maintained distance from humanity. She represented everything he had given up when he became vampire, everything he protected but could never truly have again, the vibrant mortal existence that was forever beyond his reach, no matter how long he walked among humans, pretending to be one of them. Her aliveness was almost painful to witness up close, the steady beat of her heart that he could hear clearly despite the quiet hum of the hospital around them, the warmth of her skin that contrasted so sharply with his own cold flesh, the easy way she smiled despite her injury and pain, the hope in her voice when she talked about her future and the things she wanted to see and do and experience. She was so beautifully, vibrantly human in all the ways he could never be again, mortal and warm and full of dreams that assumed she had decades ahead to pursue them, innocent of the darkness that existed in the world and the monsters that walked among humanity wearing human faces. But she was 16 years old, a child by any reasonable standard despite her intelligence and the maturity that showed in her thoughtful questions and considered responses. And Carlisle was vampire with 268 years of existence behind him, experiences and knowledge and moral complexity that made any attraction to someone so young deeply inappropriate, regardless of how drawn to her he felt. The gulf between them was not merely one of years but of fundamental nature, mortal and immortal, human and vampire, innocent girl with her whole life ahead, and creature who survived by drinking blood, even if that blood came from animals rather than people. Nothing between them was possible or appropriate. Nothing could come from this encounter except his professional care of her injury and her eventual departure from his life to pursue the dream she spoke of with such enthusiasm and hope. He was her doctor. She was his patient. The relationship was defined entirely by medical necessity and professional boundaries that he would never cross regardless of whatever connection he felt during their brief interaction. He acknowledged the attraction privately, allowed himself to feel it fully in the privacy of his own thoughts, then set it aside firmly and completely as something that could not and would not be pursued under any circumstances. He finished treating her with the same gentle efficiency he had maintained throughout, his cool hands wrapping her leg in splint and bandages with precision that ensured proper healing, his voice giving her parents careful instructions for her recovery and the signs of infection or complications they should watch for in the coming days and weeks. Keep the leg elevated when possible, change the bandages daily, watch for increasing redness or heat, or discharge that might indicate infection setting in. Bring her back immediately if fever developed, or if she experienced increasing rather than decreasing pain as the days passed. She thanked him with genuine warmth, her smile reaching her eyes in ways that made something in his chest ache despite the absence of heartbeat, her gratitude seeming to encompass more than simple appreciation for medical treatment, as if she sensed something in him that went beyond his role as physician, recognized the gentleness and compassion that he tried to maintain despite his vampire nature. Her hand touched his briefly as she thanked him, her warm fingers against his cold ones, the contact lasting only seconds, but somehow significant in ways neither could articulate. Their eyes met for a moment as she prepared to leave, her parents supporting her on either side, her weight kept carefully off the injured leg as instructed, her face still pale from shock and pain, but her smile genuine and her eyes bright with something that looked almost like recognition. Something passed between them in that brief exchange. Connection neither could name or explain. Recognition that seemed disproportionate to the brevity of their encounter and the professional nature of their interaction. Carlisle felt it like physical sensation, despite his vampire inability to feel warmth or cold, or most other physical sensations beyond thirst. Awareness that this girl mattered in ways he could not rationalize or dismiss, that she had marked him somehow in the space of an hour, that he would remember her long after she had forgotten him and moved on with her human life. He watched her leave the hospital supported by her parents, watched until they disappeared from sight beyond the hospital doors, watched the wagon pull away with her sitting in the back, her injured leg stretched out before her, her face turning back once as if she too felt the pull of whatever connection had formed between them. Then he returned to his other duties with mind that kept circling back to brown eyes and warm smile and the sound of her voice talking about dreams she hoped to achieve, the life she wanted to live beyond the confines of her small Ohio town. He told himself the attraction was meaningless, temporary fascination born from loneliness and the novelty of genuine conversation with human, who treated him as person rather than simply doctor, who asked real questions and seemed genuinely interested in his answers, who smiled at him with warmth that had nothing to do with his supernatural beauty and everything to do with appreciation for his gentleness and care. He told himself he would forget her within days, that his vampire memory might retain the encounter perfectly, but the emotional impact would fade as these things always did, that she was simply another patient among thousands he had treated across his long existence, notable only for her intelligence and warmth, but ultimately no different from countless others. But he did not forget her. Days became weeks and weeks became months, and still he thought of Esme Ann Platt, wondered how her leg was healing, whether the bone had knit properly, whether she had pursued those dreams she spoke of with such enthusiasm and hope. He allowed himself brief moments of imagining what might be possible if circumstances were different, if he were human and she were older, if the vast gulf between them could somehow be bridged, if he could offer her anything besides cursed existence as vampire companion. Then he put the thoughts aside firmly and returned to his work, to the endless succession of patients who needed his help, to the life he had built from discipline and denial, an unwavering commitment to principles that gave his immortal existence meaning and purpose. Esme left Columbus eventually, as young women did. Married man her parents approved of. Man named Charles Evenson, whose family owned property and whose prospects seemed solid to parents concerned about their daughter's future security and social standing. She moved away to build the life that was expected of young women in her time and place, the life of wife and eventual mother, the domestic existence that offered limited options but at least provided stability and social acceptance, and the security that came from marrying well. The Spanish influenza arrived in Chicago in the autumn of 1918, like invisible army, spreading through the city with terrifying speed and devastating efficiency, killing healthy adults in their prime with brutality that made the disease particularly horrifying to populations already exhausted by 4 years of World War that had drained resources and morale across the nation and the world. The epidemic overwhelmed hospitals and medical staff within weeks of its arrival, the sheer number of sick and dying far exceeding the capacity of any medical system to respond effectively, turning hospitals into warehouses of death where patients lay in hallways on improvised beds, and doctors moved from one dying person to the next, knowing that most of those they treated would be dead within days regardless of any intervention modern medicine could provide. Carlisle was working at Chicago Hospital when the epidemic reached its peak in October. One of the few doctors still functioning when so many others had fallen ill themselves or collapsed from exhaustion, trying to treat the endless stream of dying patients who arrived hourly as the disease cut through neighborhoods and families with indiscriminate cruelty. His vampire immunity to disease allowed him to work tirelessly when human physicians were succumbing to the same illness they were trying to treat. His supernatural stamina, meaning he could maintain constant vigil without rest or sleep or food. His enhanced senses allowing him to assess patients' conditions with accuracy that seemed almost miraculous to the overwhelmed staff who worked alongside him, and marveled at his endurance and dedication. The hospital was a nightmare of suffering and death, hallways filled with beds holding people for whom nothing could be done, the medical staff reduced to providing basic comfort, while influenza ran its course, killing or sparing patients according to factors no one fully understood, despite desperate attempts to identify patterns or treatments that might improve survival rates. The smell of sickness filled every corridor, the particular odor of influenza mixing with the scent of fear and death, and the desperate attempts at cleanliness that could not keep pace with the number of people dying. The sound of labored breathing and desperate coughing creating constant soundtrack of human suffering that wore on even the most hardened medical professionals. The awareness of futility hung over everything as doctors and nurses watched people die faster than bodies could be removed to make room for the next wave of patients arriving hourly, young and old and everyone in between. The disease showing particular cruelty in how it killed healthy adults in their 20s and 30s, people should have had decades ahead of them but instead drowned in their own lungs, while medicine stood helpless and useless beside their beds. Carlisle had lived through plague and epidemic before during his centuries of existence, had witnessed disease claim thousands in London and Paris and other cities where he had practiced medicine. But the speed and scale of this particular outbreak was extraordinary, even by historical standards. Elizabeth Mason was brought to the hospital in the final stages of the disease on a cold October evening, her body consumed by fever that had turned her skin burning hot to touch, her lungs drowning in fluid that made each breath a visible struggle, her life measured in hours rather than days, according to every indication Carlisle's experience and enhanced senses could detect. She was perhaps 40 years old, her face showing the ravages of the disease, but also hints of the beauty she must have possessed before illness claimed her, her wedding ring loose on fingers that had lost weight during her sickness, her clothing soaked with sweat from the fever that was burning her alive from within. But even dying, even barely conscious and struggling for each breath that rattled wetly in her damaged lungs, her concern was not for herself, but for her 17-year-old son Edward, who lay in another bed equally ill, equally dying, the influenza taking them both with the cruel democracy that characterized the epidemic's progression through families and communities. Her husband had died 2 days earlier, the disease claiming him first and fastest, leaving Elizabeth and Edward to follow him into death with the inevitability that everyone recognized but no one could prevent. Carlisle examined them both with the thoroughness his nature and his training demanded, his enhanced hearing detecting the fluid in their lungs and the weakness of their heartbeats, his sense of smell identifying the particular scent of influenza mixed with approaching death, his medical knowledge confirming what his supernatural senses told him, that neither would survive the night, that the disease had progressed too far for any intervention medicine could provide. Elizabeth Mason would die within hours, her body too damaged by fever and fluid to recover, even if by some miracle the disease itself was arrested, and her son would follow shortly after, perhaps by dawn, or perhaps lasting until the next evening, but certainly not surviving another full day. There was nothing Carlisle could do as doctor to prevent either death, no treatment that would save them, no medicine or procedure or intervention that would make any difference to the outcome that was already written in their failing bodies. He could offer morphine to ease their passing, could ensure they died without unnecessary suffering beyond what the disease itself inflicted, could perhaps arrange for them to be moved closer together so that if either regained consciousness, they might have the comfort of the other's presence in their final hours. But he could not save them through conventional medical means, could not offer any hope beyond the comfort of knowing they would die together, rather than one being forced to face the grief of surviving the other. But Elizabeth somehow sensed what Carlisle was, some dying clarity allowing her to see past his human disguise to the supernatural being beneath, perception that came from approaching death, or perhaps from desperate maternal instinct that gave her awareness beyond normal human capability. Perhaps she had noticed during his examination that his hands were too cold, his skin too pale, his movements too graceful and precise, his eyes that unusual golden color that no human possessed naturally. Perhaps she simply felt the difference in him on some instinctive level that bypassed rational thought entirely and went straight to primal awareness that something about this doctor was not quite human, despite his obvious medical skill and genuine compassion. She grabbed his hand with strength that should not have been possible given her condition, her fever-bright eyes locking onto his with desperate intensity that penetrated even his carefully maintained professional distance. Her voice barely audible, but absolutely determined as she spoke words that would change everything for both Carlisle and her dying son. She begged him to save her son, to do whatever was in his power to preserve Edward's life, to use whatever abilities he possessed that went beyond normal medicine and normal human capacity. She did not explicitly name what she sensed in him, did not speak the word vampire aloud in the crowded hospital ward where other patients and staff might overhear, but her meaning was clear and her desperation was absolute, and her certainty that he could do something beyond normal medical intervention was unshakable, despite having no rational basis for that certainty. She knew she was dying and accepted her own death with the resignation of someone who understood that some battles could not be won, that her body was too damaged and the disease too advanced for any hope of recovery. But she could not accept her son's death, could not allow him to die so young with so much life unlived, could not leave the world without knowing she had done everything possible to give him chance at survival, even if that survival came through means she did not fully understand and could not explain. Her grip on Carlisle's hand was surprisingly strong for someone so close to death, her eyes boring into his with intensity that demanded acknowledgement and response, her whole being focused on this final desperate plea on behalf of her child. Carlisle promised her nothing aloud, could not risk speaking words that might be overheard or misunderstood by others in the ward, but something in his expression must have conveyed understanding or agreement, because Elizabeth Mason's face relaxed slightly, the desperate tension easing, as if she believed he had accepted her request, as if she trusted that he would do whatever mysterious thing she sensed he could do to save her son. She released his hand and turned her head slightly toward where Edward lay, her eyes on her son's face for a long moment before the effort became too much and she closed her eyes for the final time, her breathing growing shallower and more labored until it stopped entirely perhaps 20 minutes later. Carlisle stood beside her bed after she died, listening to Edward's labored, breathing in the next bed, feeling the weight of Elizabeth Mason's last request pressing on him with force that made decision feel inevitable despite his centuries of resistance to this exact choice. Edward was alone in the world now, both parents dead within 2 days of each other. No other family to mourn him or miss him if he disappeared from the hospital. No one who would notice or question if the dying boy in bed 17 simply vanished during the chaos of the epidemic that was killing thousands across the city and creating such confusion that one missing body would never be investigated or even remarked upon. He was 17 years old, on the verge of adulthood, but not quite there, dying from disease rather than violence or accident, his life ending before it had truly begun through no fault of his own, but simply bad luck of infection during epidemic that was claiming victims indiscriminately across every social class and age group. The transformation would curse him with vampire existence, would steal his humanity and his mortality and his chance and normal human life with wife and children and career, and the ordinary progression of aging and eventual natural death that every human expected and prepared for as part of the natural order. But it would also save him from death that was otherwise certain, would give him continuation of existence even if that existence was fundamentally different from what he would have had as human, would honor his mother's dying wish and give meaning to her final desperate act of maternal love. Carlisle had told himself for decades that he would only transform someone who was dying anyway, someone for whom vampire existence would be gift rather than theft, someone who had no future as human and might therefore welcome the strange immortal life that transformation would provide. Edward met every criterion Carlisle had established for justifying the transformation he had resisted performing for over 2 centuries. Carlisle made his decision in the quiet hours before dawn, acting on combination of loneliness and compassion, and Elizabeth Mason's desperate final request before he could reconsider or rationalize his way back to solitary existence that suddenly seemed unbearably empty. He carried Edward's unconscious body from the hospital, moving with vampire speed through streets emptied by curfew and fear of contagion, bringing the dying boy to his own residence, where the transformation could occur in privacy, where Edward could burn through the 3-day change without witnesses or questions or intervention from well-meaning humans who would not understand what was happening. He bit Edward's throat and wrists, injecting venom into his system at multiple points to ensure the transformation would take hold before the influenza claimed his life, beginning the 3-day process that would remake the boy into vampire, that would curse and save him simultaneously, that would give Carlisle the companion he had craved for centuries at cost of Edward's human life and future. The venom worked quickly once introduced, spreading through Edward's dying body and beginning the process of stopping his heart while simultaneously preserving and transforming his cells. The supernatural catalyst overwhelming the disease even as it consumed his humanity and remade him into something that would never sicken or age or die. Edward's transformation was agony for both of them. The boy burning in pain he could not understand while Carlisle watched and waited and questioned every moment whether he had done right thing or committed unforgivable violation of everything he claimed to believe about respecting human life and human choice. Edward thrashed and screamed when consciousness permitted, his body arcing with pain as the venom burned through his system, his mind unable to process what was happening or why, or whether the suffering would ever end, or if this was simply what dying felt like from the inside. Carlisle stayed beside him constantly, monitoring the transformation's progress with medical precision, speaking to him when Edward seemed conscious enough to hear, explaining what was happening and promising that the pain would end, that he would wake to new existence, that he would not be alone. The 3 days felt longer than the 268 years that had preceded them, time stretching impossibly as Carlisle waited to see if Edward would survive the transformation, if the venom would complete its work before the influenza claimed him, if the boy would wake and forgive Carlisle for stealing his human life, or wake and hate him for the curse that had been imposed without permission or consent. When Edward finally opened his eyes on the 3rd day, when his gaze cleared and focused on Carlisle with awareness that was newly sharp and enhanced by vampire senses, Carlisle felt relief flood through him that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. He was no longer alone. after 268 years of solitary existence, after centuries of watching other vampires form covens and companionships while he remained isolated by his unusual principles, after decades of longing for connection with someone who would understand what he was and share his commitment to protecting human life, he finally had a companion who would understand, who would share his existence, who would perhaps adopt his vegetarian lifestyle and prove that Carlisle's way of living was not merely possible, but could be taught and learned and chosen by others. Edward adapted to his new nature with surprising speed, given the catastrophic nature of his transformation, his intelligence and self-control making the transition less chaotic than it might have been. Teaching Edward to be vampire was both easier and more difficult than Carlisle had anticipated during the long, solitary centuries when he'd imagined what companionship might be like if he ever found the courage to create it. Edward adapted to his new nature with intelligence and discipline that made the physical aspects of the transition relatively straightforward. His willingness to trust Carlisle's guidance, allowing them to establish routines and boundaries that protected nearby humans from the danger a newborn vampire naturally posed. But Edward also possessed a gift that complicated everything. Ability to read minds that gave him access to every thought of every person within considerable range. Supernatural talent that made him uniquely equipped to understand Carlisle, but also uniquely burdened by awareness of human thoughts and feelings that most vampires never had to confront directly. Edward could hear the thoughts of humans they passed on the street, could sense their fears and hopes and mundane concerns, could understand their humanity in ways that made feeding on them morally impossible for someone with Edward's conscience and capacity for empathy. He adopted Carlisle's vegetarian lifestyle not because he was forced to, but because his gift made the alternative unthinkable. Because hearing persons' thoughts and then killing them for sustenance would be psychological torture he could not endure without losing his sanity. The shared commitment to protecting human life created bond between Carlisle and Edward that went beyond creator and created beyond teacher and student, moving towards something that felt almost like father and son, despite the mere 4 years of physical age difference between them. They traveled together through the early 1920s, Carlisle and Edward passing as brothers rather than father and son, given their apparent ages, moving from Chicago to various cities across the Midwest as Carlisle's lack of aging began to draw attention and necessitated relocation. Edward struggled with the meaninglessness of immortal existence in ways that Carlisle understood but could not entirely alleviate. The emptiness of living forever without clear purpose or direction. The weight of centuries stretching ahead with nothing to fill them, but endless repetition of feeding and hiding and pretending to be human. Carlisle tried to help him find meaning through education and culture, through the endless pursuit of knowledge and beauty that had sustained Carlisle through his own early decades of vampire existence. But Edward's gift made everything more complicated. The constant awareness of others' thoughts creating noise and distraction that made concentration difficult. In 1921, Carlisle and Edward moved to Ashland, Wisconsin, a small city on the shore of Lake Superior, where Carlisle had been offered position at the local hospital, where the population was small enough that their presence would not draw excessive attention, but large enough that the hospital required a doctor with Carlisle's skills and availability for night shifts. The work was familiar and satisfying, Carlisle falling easily into patterns he had established over decades of medical practice, Edward accompanying him sometimes and watching with fascination tinged with discomfort as Carlisle treated human patients with such obvious care and dedication, despite the constant temptation their blood represented. Then one night in early spring, a woman was brought to the hospital morgue, her body believed to be deceased, carried in by men who had found her at the base of a cliff on the outskirts of town. Her injuries consistent with fall from significant height, her heartbeat so faint that the men who discovered her had assumed she was already dead and brought her to the morgue rather than the emergency ward. Carlisle was in the hospital when they brought her in, was walking past the morgue when a scent reached him that stopped him absolutely in his tracks, familiar and impossible. A scent he had not encountered in a decade, but had never forgotten despite the years and distance. He moved to the morgue with speed that was not quite human, pushed through the doors and saw the woman's face and recognized Esme Ann Platt immediately, despite the changes that 10 years and suffering had wrought in her features. She was older now, no longer 16, but perhaps 26, her face marked by pain and grief that had not been present when he had set her broken leg in Columbus Hospital all those years ago. Her beauty had matured, but also been damaged by whatever experiences had filled the decade since their first meeting. Lines around her eyes and mouth suggesting sorrows that went far beyond normal aging. Her body too thin, as if she had not been eating properly for months or perhaps years. He examined her with hands that trembled slightly despite 2 centuries of practiced steadiness, his supernatural hearing detecting what the humans had missed. The faint flutter of heartbeat, barely present but still there, still fighting, life persisting despite injuries that should have killed her and would kill her within the hour, if not sooner. She had fallen from cliff deliberately, he realized, with growing horror as he assessed her injuries and their pattern. Had thrown herself off intentionally, attempted suicide rather than accident, her broken body the result of conscious choice to end her suffering rather than misfortune or carelessness. Her body was broken in multiple places, her skull fractured, her ribs shattered, her internal injuries severe enough that even if her heart was still beating, she would not survive without intervention that went far beyond what human medicine could provide. She was dying, would be dead within the hour. Another victim of whatever suffering had driven her to that cliff edge, and the deliberate fall that should have ended her pain permanently. Carlisle stood beside the morgue table, with his mind working frantically through implications and possibilities, and the decision he knew he was going to make, even as he pretended to himself that he was still considering options. Edward appeared in the morgue doorway, having heard Carlisle's thoughts, and understood immediately who this woman was, what she had meant to him during their brief encounter a decade earlier, the connection that had formed and been suppressed because she was too young and he was vampire, and nothing between them was possible. Edward saw in Carlisle's mind the memory of vibrant 16-year-old girl with warm eyes and genuine smile, saw the contrast with this dying woman whose suffering had driven her to suicide, understood without being told that Carlisle was considering transformation, was debating whether to save her life by cursing her with vampire existence. Carlisle carried Esme from the morgue before anyone could stop him or question what he was doing, moving with vampire speed that left no time for questions or intervention, taking her to the house he and Edward shared on the outskirts of town, where the transformation could occur in absolute privacy. He explained to Edward what he was about to do and why, his voice shaking slightly as he described finding Esme all those years ago, treating her broken leg, feeling connection he had not allowed himself to pursue, remembering her through the decade that followed and wondering if she was happy. Now she was dying, had tried to kill herself, had lost something or someone so important that living had become unbearable, and he could let her die and respect her choice to end her suffering. Or he could transform her and give her new existence, new possibility, new life, even if that life was cursed with vampire nature. Edward listened without judgment, his gift allowing him to understand Carlisle's motivations completely, to sense the loneliness and longing and genuine care that drove this decision, to recognize that Carlisle was not acting from selfishness, but from inability to let this particular woman die when he had the power to save her. Edward said nothing, simply stepped back and allowed Carlisle to do what he had already decided to do, to bite Esme's throat and wrists, to inject venom into her dying system, to begin the 3-day transformation that would remake her into vampire if she survived the process. Esme's transformation was quieter than Edward's had been, her body too damaged to thrash much during the burning, her suffering internal and silent, the venom working to heal her catastrophic injuries while simultaneously converting her cells from human to vampire. Carlisle stayed beside her constantly, monitoring her heartbeat as it slowly strengthened, watching her broken bones knit back together with supernatural speed, seeing her bruised and damaged skin heal and smooth into marble perfection. He talked to her sometimes even though she could not hear him, explained what was happening and why, told her about vampire nature and vegetarian lifestyle and the choice he had made on her behalf without her permission or consent. He told her about remembering her through the decades since their first meeting, about wondering if her life had turned out well, about hoping she had found happiness and achieved the dreams she spoke of with such enthusiasm when she was 16. He apologized for transforming her without asking, for stealing her choice and her human life, for cursing her with vampire existence because he could not bear to let her die when he had the power to prevent it. He promised he would help her adjust to her new nature, would teach her everything he knew about living as vampire without becoming monster, would give her whatever support she needed to build new life from the ashes of the one she had tried to end. When Esme woke on the 3rd day, when her eyes opened and showed the crimson that characterized newborn vampires, when she looked at Carlisle with new awareness and supernatural senses that allowed her to see him clearly for the first time, the first thing she did was smile. Not the confused disorientation Edward had shown, not the horror Carlisle himself had felt at his own transformation, simply smile of recognition and contentment, as if waking as vampire in Carlisle's presence was exactly where she had always wanted to be, as if the decade of separation and suffering had been worth enduring, because it had brought her to this moment. She remembered him, she explained once she could speak, had never forgotten the gentle doctor who had treated her broken leg with such care when she was 16, had thought of him often through the years that followed, had measured every man she met against the impossible standard he had set during their brief encounter. She had married Charles Evanson because her parents insisted, and because at 19 she did not know how to refuse their expectations, had endured 5 years of abuse and cruelty because she believed marriage was permanent commitment that must be honored regardless of suffering it caused. She had given birth to a son 2 years into the marriage, a baby boy she had loved with desperate intensity that came from having so little else in her life worth loving, had poured all her capacity for affection and hope into this tiny human who depended on her completely. But the baby had died 3 days after birth, his lungs too weak to sustain life, his tiny body failing despite everything doctors could do, and despite Esme's prayers and desperate pleas for his survival. The grief of losing him had broken something fundamental in her, had destroyed whatever fragile ability she possessed to continue enduring her husband's cruelty and her own unhappiness. She had left Charles finally, gathered courage to abandon marriage that was killing her slowly, fled to Wisconsin, where she had a distant cousin who might offer shelter and support. But the grief followed her, the awareness that her baby was dead and she had failed to protect him, the emptiness of existence without him overwhelming whatever relief she felt at escaping her abusive husband. She had climbed the cliff intending to end her pain permanently, to join her son in death since she could not keep him alive, to escape the unbearable weight of grief and failure and the profound loneliness of existing without anyone who loved her or whom she could love. Carlisle explained what he had done, told her about her suicide attempt and near death, described the transformation he had performed without her consent, offered apologies for taking her human life and cursing her with vampire existence. But Esme did not seem upset or angry, or even surprised by what he had done. He had not stolen her life because her life was already over in every way that mattered, had not cursed her because existence without her child was already hell, had given her something she had not expected, but found herself grateful for regardless of how strange or impossible it seemed. They fell in love with the ease of people who had already been in love for years without acknowledging it, the decade of separation and the changed circumstances doing nothing to diminish the connection they had both felt during that first meeting in Columbus. Esme adapted to vampire nature with remarkable grace, her gentle personality remaining intact despite the transformation, her capacity for love and nurturing undimmed by becoming supernatural predator. She adopted the vegetarian lifestyle without complaint or difficulty, following Carlisle's example because she trusted him completely, because protecting human life aligned with her own values, because she could not imagine feeding on humans when doing so would disappoint the man she loved. They married quietly in ceremony that was more symbolic than legal. Two vampires pledging themselves to each other for the eternity that stretched ahead, finding in each other the companionship and love that both had thought was forever beyond their reach. Carlisle had his family now, small but genuine. Edward and Esme, the two people he had transformed and who had become more important to him than anything in his centuries of existence. The house they shared became home in ways his previous residences had never been, filled with warmth despite the cold bodies of its inhabitants, alive with conversation and laughter and the simple comfort of being among people who truly knew and accepted him completely. Esme transformed every place they lived into sanctuary. Her gift for creating beauty and comfort, manifesting in how she arranged furniture and chose colors and made spaces feel welcoming and peaceful. She was the heart of their small family, her nurturing nature finding expression in caring for Carlisle and Edward, even though neither required traditional care. Her capacity for love making their house feel like true home rather than simply shelter. Edward and Carlisle had settled into comfortable rhythm, their relationship evolving from creator and created into something that resembled father and son, despite the complications of their actual ages and the unusual circumstances of their connection. Edward still struggled with the weight of immortal existence, with the constant noise of others' thoughts in his mind, with the difficulty of finding meaning in life that would stretch forever without clear purpose or ultimate destination. But having Carlisle and Esme provided anchor that made the struggle more bearable, family that gave him reason to continue existing, even when existence itself felt empty or pointless. But Edward remained alone in ways that grew more pronounced as time passed, the only one of the three without romantic companion, watching Carlisle and Esme's happiness with mixture of joy for them and awareness of his own continued solitude. He saw how they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching, heard in Carlisle's thoughts the depth of love and gratitude he felt for Esme's presence in his life, understood through his gift exactly what he was missing, and exactly how profound that absence was. Carlisle noticed Edward's isolation, felt guilt that his own happiness emphasized his son's lack thereof, began considering whether there might be someone out there who could be for Edward what Esme was for him, someone who might complete their small family and give Edward the companionship he deserved. The desire to expand their family grew stronger as the years passed, not from dissatisfaction with what they had, but from recognition that Edward needed partner, that their household could accommodate more members, that perhaps they might build something larger and more complex than the simple trio they currently were. Carlisle and Esme discussed it in quiet moments, her maternal instinct agreeing with his assessment that Edward needed someone, that their family felt incomplete with one member alone while two were paired, that bringing another vampire into their household might balance the dynamics and give Edward what he so clearly lacked. In 1933, Carlisle was working in a hospital in Rochester, New York, his reputation as skilled surgeon well established, his night shifts allowing him to practice medicine without drawing excessive attention to his unusual characteristics. He was walking home from hospital in early hours of morning when he found Rosalie Hale dying in the street not far from the building where he worked, her broken body left in the gutter by the men who had violated and brutalized her, her beauty destroyed by violence, her life bleeding away into the street, while snow fell softly around her and covered her torn clothing and blood-stained skin with white that turned pink and then red as more blood seeped from her wounds. She had been 18 years old, engaged to be married to a wealthy man named Royce King, whose family owned significant property and business interests in the area. Her life seemingly perfect from outside perspective, but hollow and unhappy beneath the surface glamour of beautiful clothes and expensive jewelry and the admiration her appearance attracted wherever she went. She had been the most beautiful girl in Rochester, perhaps in all of upstate New York, her blonde hair and violet eyes and perfect features making her object of universal admiration and envy. Her engagement to Royce King, the culmination of what everyone expected from someone with her advantages and appearance. But her fiancé and his friends had attacked her after a night of drinking, had raped and beaten her with casual cruelty that spoke to how little they valued her beyond her decorative function, had violated her in ways that destroyed not just her body, but her sense of safety, and her belief that beauty was advantage rather than target. They had left her dying in the street like garbage to be discarded, her screams unheard or ignored by anyone who might have helped her in time to prevent the worst of what happened. The snow muffling sound and the late hour meaning few people were on the streets to witness her suffering. Carlisle found her while walking home from the hospital in the early hours of morning, heard her faint heartbeat beneath the snow, smelled the blood mixed with the scent of alcohol and men's cologne and Rosalie's own perfume, discovered her broken body in the gutter where they had left her to die alone in the cold and darkness. He knelt beside her and assessed her injuries with medical precision that could not entirely override the emotional response to seeing someone so young and so brutalized. His enhanced senses telling him that she had been violated repeatedly, beaten severely, her injuries internal and external, her life measured in minutes rather than hours. The rage he felt was unprecedented in his centuries of existence. Fury at the cruelty and violence that could reduce young woman to this. Anger at the men who had done this and left her to die alone. Hatred for the casual evil that treated human life as disposable and women as objects to be used and destroyed without consequence or remorse. He recognized the men's sense, could track them easily if he chose, could find each one and deliver justice that human law would never provide to woman whose word would be questioned and whose virtue would be impugned if she survived to accuse her wealthy attackers. But revenge could wait. The immediate question was whether to save Rosalie or allow her to die, whether to transform her and curse her with vampire existence or respect what might be her preference to escape through death, rather than continue living with the trauma of what had been done to her. He carried her home quickly, making the decision as he moved, unwilling to let her die when he had power to prevent it, unable to grant victory to the men who had destroyed her by allowing their violence to claim her life. He burst into the house with her bloody and broken in his arms, Esme gasping at the sight, Edward reading Carlisle's thoughts and understanding immediately what he intended to do. He transformed her, hoping she might become companion for Edward, hoping they might find in each other what Carlisle and Esme had found, hoping to complete his family with one more member who would give Edward the happiness he deserved and balance their household with two couples rather than one couple and one solitary figure. Esme supported the decision immediately, her maternal instincts responding to Rosalie's suffering, her capacity for love expanding to include this broken girl who would wake as vampire and need guidance and support through the difficult transition. She cleaned Rosalie's wounds while the transformation began, washing away the blood and the evidence of violation with gentle hands, dressing her in clean clothes, treating her with the tenderness she would have shown her own daughter. Edward said nothing, simply watched as Carlisle bit Rosalie's throat and wrists, as the venom began its work, as her heartbeat strengthened and her broken bones began to heal with supernatural speed. He could hear her dying thoughts, The pain and fear and desperate wish for death or unconsciousness. The awareness of what had been done to her and the absolute certainty that she would rather die than live with the memory and the shame. He wondered if Carlisle had made the right choice, if transforming her was gift or additional violation, if she would wake grateful or furious at being denied the death she had been seeking. But Rosalie woke angry rather than grateful, furious at what had been done to her both by her attackers and by Carlisle, rejecting the vampire existence she had not chosen, mourning the human life and possibilities that had been stolen from her twice over. First, by the men who violated her, and then by the vampire who transformed her without her permission. She adapted to vampire nature quickly, her intelligence and willpower making her physically powerful and controlled despite her newborn status. Her supernatural beauty even more striking than her human appearance had been. Her blonde hair now lustrous and perfect, her features flawless, her body strong and graceful in ways that should have brought satisfaction, but only emphasized what she had lost. She never forgave Carlisle completely for transforming her, never became the grateful daughter he had hoped for, never looked at Edward with anything except sisterly indifference, despite Carlisle's hopes that they might become romantic partners. Edward could read her thoughts and understood her suffering and her anger, could sense that she blamed Carlisle for cursing her, even while recognizing intellectually that he had saved her life, could see that she wanted nothing from him romantically and felt no attraction to him beyond basic family affection. The hope that they might pair off dissolved within days of her awakening, the reality of their personalities and desires making romantic connection impossible despite Carlisle's well-intentioned planning. The family adjusted to Rosalie's presence with difficulty, absorbed her anger and grief as best they could, gave her space to process her transformation at her own pace, even as her bitterness cast shadow over the household that had previously been characterized by harmony and affection. She was family now regardless of whether she wanted to be, part of the small coven Carlisle was building from the dying and the lost, another person whose life he had saved and cursed in equal measure, another reminder that good intentions did not always produce gratitude or happiness. Her presence changed the household dynamics dramatically, the easy affection that had characterized their home becoming more complicated and tense. Esme approached Rosalie with maternal warmth and patience, never demanding gratitude or affection, but simply offering steady acceptance and support, creating space where Rosalie could express her anger without fear of rejection or punishment. She understood in ways Carlisle could not what it meant to lose the possibility of children, to have the future you imagined stolen completely, to wake into existence that foreclosed options you had assumed would always be available. Esme had lost her baby and knew that grief intimately could offer Rosalie understanding that came from shared experience rather than simple sympathy. Edward maintained careful distance, respecting Rosalie's clear desire for no romantic involvement, treating her as sister rather than potential partner, his gift allowing him to understand her suffering completely, even as it made living with her constant resentment exhausting. He heard her thoughts constantly, the litany of grief and anger and longing for the human life she would never have, the children she would never bear, the normal existence that had been stolen first by her attackers and then by her transformation. The household that had been peaceful became tense. The easy affection between Carlisle and Esme contrasting sharply with Rosalie's isolation and anger. Carlisle struggled with guilt over transforming her, questioned whether he had acted rightly in saving her life without her consent, wondered if perhaps he should have let her die rather than imposing vampire existence on someone who so clearly did not want it. He tried to reach her, to explain his reasoning, to help her find meaning in her new existence, but she remained distant and angry, accepting his guidance on practical matters but rejecting any deeper connection or forgiveness. The family he had hoped to build felt fractured, incomplete, damaged by good intentions that had produced suffering rather than happiness. Rosalie's happiness arrived unexpectedly in 1935 when she was hunting alone in the mountains of Tennessee, tracking large bear through dense forest, her enhanced senses following the animal's scent and the sound of its movement through underbrush. She found the bear, but she also found something else, someone else, a young man who had encountered the same bear and come out very much the worse for the confrontation. Emmett McCarty was lying in clearing, his body torn open by the bear's claws, blood pooling beneath him in quantities that meant death was minutes away rather than hours, his life draining into the forest floor while he stared at the sky with the strange clarity that sometimes came in final moments. He was still conscious, still aware, his eyes tracking clouds above him with acceptance of death written across his face, even as his body fought desperately to survive the catastrophic injuries. Rosalie saw him and felt something she had not felt since her transformation, something beyond the constant grief and anger that had defined her vampire existence for 2 years. He was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with classical features or refined elegance, beautiful in his strength and vitality even while dying, beautiful in his size and his obvious physical power, beautiful in the way he faced death without apparent fear or regret or desperate bargaining with fate. She stood over him, watching him die, knowing she could save him, knowing also that saving him meant condemning him to vampire existence, meant making the same choice for him that Carlisle had made for her, meant potentially cursing him with the same grief and anger that she herself felt constantly. But she could not let him die. The realization came with absolute clarity that overrode all her usual bitterness. The understanding that this man dying in front of her was somehow important, somehow meant to be saved, somehow destined to be part of her existence in ways she could not explain or rationalize, but simply knew with certainty. She gathered him in her arms, this massive man who was still larger than her despite her vampire strength, and began running, carrying him through over 100 miles of forest and farmland, moving with supernatural speed toward home, toward Carlisle, who could complete the transformation she did not trust herself to perform correctly. She burst into the house with Emmett dying in her arms 2 days later, blood covering them both, her face desperate and determined in ways the family had never seen from her before. The family of 5 settled into rhythms that would define their existence for the next decade. Carlisle and Esme as the foundation. Edward still alone but less isolated with Emmett's enthusiasm filling the house. Rosalie and Emmett inseparable in their devotion to each other. They moved every few years as Carlisle's pattern had always been, relocating before his lack of aging drew attention, establishing new cover stories in new cities, Carlisle always finding position at local hospital where his skills were valued, and his night shifts explained his absence during daylight hours. Esme made each new house into home with her characteristic grace, decorating and arranging spaces that felt warm despite housing cold beings, creating sanctuary wherever they settled. The household had found its balance after the tumultuous period of Rosalie's angry awakening and Emmett's enthusiastic arrival. Carlisle and Esme maintained their role as the center, their relationship deepening with each passing year, their partnership becoming more seamless as they learned to anticipate each other's needs and thoughts. Without Edward's gift of telepathy, they were true partners in every sense, sharing decisions about the family's movements and finances, discussing how to handle each member's struggles and needs, presenting united front that gave the others stability and security. Edward pursued education endlessly, enrolling in universities when their apparent ages allowed it, studying music and literature and languages and whatever else caught his interest during their stays in various cities. His gift made formal education somewhat tedious, since he could read his professor's thoughts and know the material before it was taught. But the structure gave his immortal existence some semblance of purpose, and the social interaction helped combat the isolation that threatened to overwhelm him despite being surrounded by family. He'd become accomplished pianist, his vampire precision and perfect memory allowing him to master pieces that would challenge even the most skilled human musicians, his playing filling their homes with beauty that seemed to ease everyone's spirits. Rosalie and Emmett attended high school when necessary to maintain their cover stories, playing the parts of teenagers despite being decades old. Their obvious coupledom making them popular subjects of gossip and speculation among their human classmates. Rosalie had softened considerably since finding Emmett. Her anger, her transformation, still present but no longer the defining characteristic of her existence. Her capacity for love finding expression in a devotion to the man she had saved and who had saved her in turn from the bitterness that had threatened to consume her completely. Emmett's perpetual good humor balanced her occasional melancholy, his ability to find joy in their existence helping her appreciate what she had rather than constantly mourning what she had lost. Carlisle continued his medical practice with a dedication that had characterized his work for centuries, finding satisfaction in saving lives and treating suffering even as the repetition sometimes wore on him. Each patient was unique in their suffering, even if their conditions were familiar. Each life saved was victory against death, even if death would eventually claim them anyway. Each moment of healing was the affirmation of his choice to use his vampire nature for good rather than evil. Esme supported his work while creating her own purpose in restoration and design, buying properties that needed renovation and transforming them with her vision and skill, channeling her nurturing instincts into creating beautiful spaces, since she could not create the children she still mourned. The household functioned smoothly, each member finding their role, the family unit becoming more cohesive with each passing year as they learned to accommodate each other's needs and quirks, and the various ways their gifts and personalities interacted. They had family dinners where no one ate, gathering around tables laden with food prepared for appearance's sake, the ritual of coming together more important than the meal itself. They celebrated holidays with decorations and gifts, and the performances of normalcy, that helped them feel connected to the human world they lived in, but could never truly be part of. They had routines and traditions that made their immortal existence feel less empty, less endless, less like simple survival and more like actual living. In 1948, everything changed again when two vampires appeared at their home in upstate New York on an ordinary evening in spring, arriving without warning or invitation, simply walking up to the house as if they had been expected all along. Edward sensed them first through his gift, hearing their thoughts before they were visible, his mind registering surprise and confusion as he processed what he was hearing from the approaching strangers. The woman was tiny and pixie-like, her thoughts filled with visions of futures that shifted and changed as decisions were made, her consciousness unlike anything Edward had encountered before, her mind showing him images of events that had not yet occurred mixed with memories of visions she had already experienced. The man beside her was taller and leaner, his thoughts heavy with old guilt and constant awareness of emotions around him, his discomfort palpable even at distance, his mind a chaotic swirl of feeling, others' feelings mixed with his own responses to those emotions and his attempts to control both. Edward alerted Carlisle and Esme immediately, his voice carrying through the house as he announced that they had visitors approaching, vampires he had never encountered before, but who seemed to know exactly where they were going and why. Carlisle and Esme emerged from the house as the two vampires approached, Carlisle's posture careful but not hostile, his centuries of diplomatic experience evident in how he positioned himself to appear welcoming while still protecting his family if these strangers proved threatening. Esme beside him with her characteristic warmth tempered by appropriate caution about unexpected visitors, her maternal instincts making her simultaneously want to welcome them and ensure they posed no danger to her family. The others gathered behind them, Edward translating the approaching vampire's thoughts, Emmett ready for potential conflict, Rosalie watchful and suspicious. The woman spoke first, her voice bright and certain, introducing herself as Alice and her companion as Jasper, explaining that she had seen them in her visions, had known they would become family, had tracked them across the country based on future events she witnessed before they occurred. Her confidence was absolute despite having never met them before, her certainty that they belonged here unshakable, her smile genuine and delighted, as if she had finally arrived home after a long journey through territory that had always been foreign and uncomfortable. She spoke their names as if she had known them for years, mentioned details about their household that she should not have known, demonstrated through her specific knowledge that her visions were genuine and accurate. Alice possessed the gift of seeing the future, or rather seeing possible futures based on decisions people made, her visions shifting and changing as choices altered outcomes, giving her roadmap of probability rather than certainty. She explained that she had seen herself and Jasper joining the Cullens, had seen decades of future happiness with this family, had followed her visions from their previous location to this house in New York, where she knew they would be welcomed. She spoke with the easy familiarity of someone who had already lived years with them in her visions, who knew their habits and personalities and the dynamics of their household, despite this being their first actual meeting in physical reality, rather than in the possible futures she witnessed constantly. Jasper remained silent beside her, his expression wary and uncomfortable, his posture suggesting someone ready to flee at any moment if the situation turned threatening. He possessed a different gift, the ability to sense and manipulate emotions in those around him, to feel what others felt, and to change those feelings through his supernatural talent. The constant awareness of others' emotions was burden he carried visibly, his shoulders tense, his golden eyes darting between the Cullens as if assessing threat levels and escape routes, his whole being radiating discomfort despite Alice's obvious ease and confidence. He could feel their curiosity and caution, their wariness mixed with intrigue, their family bonds creating emotional resonance that was beautiful and painful simultaneously. Carlisle welcomed them despite his uncertainty, trusting Alice's visions enough to give them chance, seeing in Jasper's haunted expression something that resonated with his own early years of struggling with vampire nature and finding way to live according to principles that violated instinct. He invited them inside, gesturing toward the house with genuine hospitality, his voice warm as he assured them they were welcome to stay as long as they needed to rest and explain their situation more fully, to see if Alice's visions proved accurate about their place in this family. Esme immediately moved to make them comfortable, despite vampires not requiring comfort in traditional sense, her hospitality extending automatically to these unexpected guests who might become family if Alice's visions proved accurate. Alice explained over the following hours that she had no memories of her human life, that she had woken as vampire in 1920 with no knowledge of who she had been, or who had transformed her, or what circumstances had led to her change. Her first conscious memory was of having visions of the future, and specifically of Jasper, seeing this man she had never met, but somehow knowing he was important, that he was meant to be part of her existence. She had seen him in her visions for decades before actually meeting him, had known they would be together, had tracked him based on decisions she saw him making in possible futures, following the thread of probability that led from his choices to their eventual meeting. She had found Jasper in diner in Philadelphia in 1948, had walked up to him and announced that they were going to fall in love and join family of vampires who did not feed on humans. And somehow Jasper had believed her enough to follow her across the country to this house in New York. Perhaps it was her certainty that convinced him, or perhaps it was his gift sensing the genuine love and hope in her emotions, or perhaps it was simply that he was desperate enough for different life that he was willing to trust this strange vampire who claimed to see the future and promised him peace he had never known. Jasper's story emerged slowly over the following weeks, his past revealed in fragments rather than complete narrative, the details painful enough that he shared them reluctantly and only when pressed by direct questions or when his gift picked up curiosity from the family that demanded response. He had been transformed during the Civil War in Texas in 1863, barely 20 years old, when vampire named Maria changed him and recruited him into her army. He had been major in the Confederate cavalry, dying from wounds received in battle when Maria found him and saw in him the potential for leadership and the military training that would make him a valuable asset in her supernatural conflicts. Maria created armies of newborn vampires to fight territorial wars against other covens in the South, using the superior strength and ferocity of newly transformed vampires as weapons in her campaigns to control territory and feeding grounds. The newborn vampires were unstable and violent, their first year of existence characterized by strength that exceeded even normal vampire abilities, their bloodlust so intense that control was nearly impossible, their value as soldiers lasting only until that first year passed, and their strength diminished to normal vampire levels. Then they became liabilities rather than assets, mouths to feed and bodies to manage, without the combat effectiveness that had made them useful. Jasper had been soldier and trainer in Maria's service for decades, had created hundreds of newborn vampires for her armies, had trained them to fight and kill and follow orders, and then had been forced to destroy them when their usefulness ended, and Maria commanded him to eliminate the excess vampires who were no longer worth keeping. He had killed so many, destroyed so many lives, both in creating them and in ending them, his gift forcing him to feel their fear and confusion and pain as he destroyed them, the emotional toll accumulating until he could barely function under the weight of so much absorbed suffering. He had spent 85 years in that existence, trapped by Maria's hold over him and his own sense of duty, unable to imagine different life or different purpose beyond the endless cycle of creating and destroying and fighting for territory that meant nothing to him personally, but everything to Maria's ambitions. The violence had worn on him in ways that went beyond simple exhaustion, had damaged something fundamental in him, had made him question whether vampires were capable of anything beyond destruction and death and the endless consumption of human life for sustenance and entertainment. Alice had saved him from that existence, had offered him different path, had shown him through her visions that peaceful existence was possible, that he did not have to live in violence and death, that there was family waiting who would accept him despite his past and his struggles. But transitioning to vegetarian lifestyle was extraordinarily difficult for Jasper, perhaps the most difficult transition any of them had experienced, including Carlisle's own early attempts to resist his nature. His decades of feeding on humans and his constant exposure to human emotions through his gift made resistance nearly impossible. Every human he encountered broadcasting their feelings directly into his consciousness, their emotions affecting his own state, their blood calling to him with intensity amplified by his awareness of their inner lives. He struggled daily with a thirst, slipped occasionally despite his best efforts, and Alice's support. The family of 7 needed permanent home, a place where they could settle for longer than the few years their pattern usually allowed, where the constant rain and cloud cover would permit them to move about during daytime without revealing their sparkling skin to human observation, where they might build something more stable than the nomadic existence they had maintained for decades. Carlisle studied maps and climate data with characteristic thoroughness, researching small towns across the northern United States, looking for the perfect combination of weather and isolation and medical facilities where he could practice his profession and maintain the cover story that explained their presence and their resources. He discovered Forks, Washington, in the mid-1930s, a tiny town on the Olympic Peninsula where rain fell more days than not, where the sun was rare visitor rather than constant presence, where thick forest provided hunting grounds and small population meant less chance of their nature being discovered. The town was perfect for their purposes, isolated and overlooked, tucked away on the western edge of the continental United States, where the Pacific Ocean met ancient forests, where the weather was reliably overcast and gloomy, where the kind of people who chose to live there valued privacy and minded their own business. Carlisle secured position at Fawkes Hospital in 1936, his credentials impeccable, his willingness to work any hours making him invaluable to the small medical facility. The family purchased property outside town limits, a house surrounded by forest where they could come and go without constant observation. Esme immediately began transforming the structure into home, her vision and skill creating spaces that felt welcoming despite housing beings who generated no warmth, her attention to detail making every room beautiful and comfortable. They had been in Fawkes only a few weeks when the first encounter occurred. When their presence triggered transformation, they did not anticipate or understand until Edward heard thoughts that should not have been possible. Human consciousness inside wolf bodies, confusion and rage, and protective instinct driving massive creatures toward confrontation. The Quileute tribe carried in their bloodlines genetic capacity to transform into shapeshifters, giant wolves designed to protect their people from vampires. The transformation, hereditary but dormant, triggered only by vampire presence nearby. The presence of Carlisle's family activated defensive mechanism that had lain dormant for generations. Young Quileute men phasing unexpectedly into massive wolves. Whenever emotions ran high, their normal lives disrupted completely by supernatural change they could not control. The wolves tracked the Cullens easily, their instincts identifying the family as threats that needed to be eliminated or driven away to protect the tribe. The pack, led by Ephraim Black, prepared for confrontation, ready to destroy the vampires who had invaded their territory. The first face-to-face meeting happened on neutral ground, the boundary between Quileute land and the area where the Cullens hunted, serving as meeting place where neither group could claim territorial advantage. Carlisle led his family carefully, his posture non-threatening, his entire demeanor radiating peaceful intent even as the massive wolves circled them growling. The wolves were terrifying even to vampires, their size and coordination making them genuinely dangerous opponents, their supernatural heat capable of burning vampire flesh in ways that normal fire would. Carlisle spoke to them calmly, addressing them as equals despite their wolf forms, recognizing their intelligence and humanity, showing respect for their nature, just as he hoped they might respect his family's unusual characteristics. He explained that his family fed exclusively on animal blood, that they had never harmed humans and never would, that their presence in Fawkes was meant to be long-term, that they wanted peaceful coexistence rather than conflict. Edward's gift proved crucial during negotiations, his ability to read minds allowing him to hear the wolves' thoughts even in animal forms, to understand their concerns more completely than words alone could convey. The negotiations continued over several meetings, each encounter building trust incrementally. Carlisle's sincerity evident even to skeptical wolves, his obvious distress at causing unwanted transformations resonating with beings who understood what it meant to have normal life stripped away by forces beyond control. Ephraim Black eventually phased back to human form to speak directly with Carlisle, the two leaders finding they had more in common than their different natures would suggest. Both burdened with the responsibility for protecting families, both willing to compromise if compromise meant peace. The treaty they agreed to was simple in core requirements, but profound in implications. The Cullens would never bite a human, whether to feed or transform, on Quileute land or anywhere else within the region. They would not trespass on Quileute territory, respecting boundaries the tribe established. In exchange, the Quileutes would not reveal the Cullens' nature to other humans, would allow them to live in Forks peacefully, would consider them neutral parties rather than enemies despite natural enmity between their species. The treaty line was established physically, marked stones and natural landmarks, creating boundary both sides agreed to respect, invisible to humans but absolutely clear to vampires and wolves. Carlisle felt profound relief when the treaty was finalized, grateful his family could remain in Forks without constant threat of war, satisfied they'd achieved peace through negotiation rather than force. The family settled into life in Forks with unprecedented stability, the years there peaceful and fulfilling, but eventually the inevitable problem of not aging forced them to leave. They returned to Forks in 2003, nearly 70 years after their first residence, long enough that anyone who might remember them would be elderly or deceased. Carlisle contacted the tribe before moving back, ensuring their return would not violate the agreement. The current generation agreed to reinstate the treaty, understanding that the family's arrival would likely trigger transformations in tribal members who carried the gene, but accepting this burden in exchange for peace. Carlisle resumed his position at Forks Hospital, becoming chief of surgery within months, his skills making him invaluable to the facility. Esme threw herself into renovating their property with joy at returning to a place that felt like home. The others enrolled in Forks High School, maintaining their cover stories, Edward finding the return to high school particularly tedious after decades of the same curriculum. Then, Bella Swan arrived in January of 2005, and everything changed for Edward in ways that terrified Carlisle and threatened everything they had built. Edward's first encounter with Bella in biology class was catastrophic, her scent hitting him with force that nearly destroyed his control, her blood calling to him more powerfully than any humans ever had. He fled the classroom and considered leaving Forks entirely, calling Carlisle to explain that Bella Swan's presence made the town uninhabitable for him. But Edward returned after a week, drawn by fascination that went beyond bloodlust, intrigued by his inability to read her mind when everyone else's thoughts were open to him. The combination of irresistible blood and impenetrable mind created obsession that evolved into love, despite Edward knowing that his presence endangered her. Carlisle watched Edward's fascination with a mixture of concern and understanding, recognizing the pattern he had experienced with Esme. The inability to stay away despite knowing proximity meant danger. The situation became dramatically more dangerous when Edward saved Bella's life in the school parking lot in March, using supernatural speed and strength to stop Tyler Crowley's van from crushing her, acting on instinct without considering implications of revealing his abilities publicly. Carlisle treated Bella in the emergency room afterward, his professional manner hiding deep concern about what Edward had done, what witnesses might have seen, what questions Bella might ask about the impossible rescue. Edward and Bella's relationship developed over following months. Despite Edward's attempts to maintain distance, their connection deepening into genuine love rather than teenage infatuation. Bella eventually learned the truth about the Cullens, through combination of research and Edward's confession. Carlisle met with her after Edward revealed their nature, explaining more completely what they were, how they lived, why their family was different. He told her about his transformation, about discovering animal blood could sustain him, about building a family who chose compassion over predatory nature. He explained about the treaty with the Quileutes, the boundaries they could not cross, the prohibition against biting humans that kept the peace. He was honest about the dangers of her relationship with Edward, about how her scent affected him, about living with constant low-level danger that could become catastrophic if control ever slipped. But he also saw how Edward looked at Bella, recognized the depth of feeling, understood that Edward had found something he had been searching for through 9 decades of vampire existence. The James incident in March brought dangers into sharp focus when a nomadic vampire decided to hunt Bella, his obsession with taking prey from another vampire overriding territorial boundaries. The family mobilized to protect her, the strategy failing when James outmaneuvered them and lured Bella away. The confrontation left Bella severely injured, Edward extracting venom from her wound while fighting his thirst. Carlisle treated her injuries after the attack, marveling at her resilience and commitment to staying in Edward's life despite experiencing directly how dangerous that life could be. Then came Bella's 18th birthday party in September, an event that ended in disaster when a paper cut triggered Jasper's imperfect control, his lunge toward Bella resulting in Edward shoving her into a table covered with glass. Carlisle treated her arm with steady hands despite the blood, internally devastated by proof that his family was dangerous to this girl, no matter how much they cared about her. Edward decided to leave Forks shortly after, believing his presence was too dangerous, telling Bella he no longer wanted her to make her believe she should move on. Carlisle supported Edward's decision reluctantly, understanding the reasoning, even while questioning whether leaving would protect Bella or simply devastate her emotionally. The family relocated to Ithaca, trying to adjust to life without Bella, even as Edward spiraled into depression that alarmed everyone. Eventually, circumstances brought Edward and Bella back together, the family returning to Forks with Bella accepted as permanent part of their existence, Carlisle and Esme preparing for her eventual transformation and whatever challenges that would bring. Edward and Bella's wedding in August of 2006 was everything Carlisle had hoped for his son, the ceremony bringing together human and vampire worlds in celebration of love that had survived separation and danger and every obstacle that circumstance and nature had placed in its path. Carlisle officiated at the wedding, his voice steady and warm as he spoke the words that joined Edward and Bella in marriage. His joy at seeing Edward finally happy, profound and genuine. His satisfaction at welcoming Bella into the family officially outweighing his concerns about what her eventual transformation would mean. Esme had worked with the wedding planner to create something beautiful. The house and grounds transformed with thousands of flowers, the celebration attended by friends both human and vampire. Bella and Edward honeymooned on Isle Esme, the private island off the coast of Brazil that Carlisle had given to Esme as wedding gift decades before. Perfect location for privacy and for Edward to be with Bella without constant vigilance required in populated areas. The honeymoon was meant to be 2 weeks of peace before Bella's transformation, which Edward had agreed to perform after the wedding. But Alice called Edward after the first week, with concern in her voice, her visions showing something unexpected, something that should not be possible given what everyone understood about vampire biology and reproduction. Bella spoke to Carlisle on the phone from the island, describing symptoms that alarmed him immediately, even as his medical mind rejected the possibility those symptoms suggested. She was exhausted despite sleeping long hours, nauseous at the smell of food, her body changing in ways that seemed distinctly familiar to anyone who had witnessed human pregnancy. Carlisle asked careful questions about her symptoms, about timing, about what had occurred on the island, his mind working through the impossibility, while his medical training insisted on considering even unlikely diagnoses. He confirmed what he barely believed himself, that Bella appeared to be pregnant, that somehow Edward's body had retained reproductive capability despite being transformed in 1918. Edward and Bella returned to Forks immediately, the unprecedented situation requiring Carlisle's expertise and the family's support. Carlisle examined Bella thoroughly, using equipment he brought from the hospital, performing ultrasound that showed what should not exist, her fetus developing rapidly inside Bella's human body, growing at rate far beyond normal human pregnancy. The growth was exponential and accelerating, the fetus already showing development that should take months occurring in mere days. The supernatural nature of the child evident in every measurement Carlisle took. The family divided immediately over what should be done, Edward demanding that Bella terminate the pregnancy to save her life, Carlisle agreeing reluctantly that the pregnancy posed catastrophic danger to Bella's survival. But Rosalie moved to stand beside Bella with fierce determination, declaring that she would not allow anyone to harm this baby, that this hybrid child represented everything Rosalie had lost when she was transformed, that she would protect the unborn child with her immortal life if necessary. Bella herself was absolutely resolute in her decision to continue the pregnancy regardless of danger, her choice final and non-negotiable, despite Edward's desperate pleas and Carlisle's medical warnings. Carlisle and Esme found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict for the first time in their relationship. His medical opinion that the pregnancy should be terminated, conflicting with her maternal instinct to support Bella's choice to continue regardless of risk. They had private conversations away from the others, working through the disagreement with the patience and respect their decades together had taught them. Finding compromise in Carlisle's commitment to do everything medically possible to save both mother and child, even while believing the attempt would likely fail. Esme's perspective helped him see that Bella's choice deserved respect, even if he disagreed with it, that his role was to support her decision rather than override it. The pregnancy progressed with terrifying speed, Bella's body breaking under the strain within weeks, her ribs cracking from internal pressure as the supernaturally strong fetus moved and grew, her spine beginning to fracture, her human frame inadequate to contain what was developing inside her. Carlisle monitored her constantly, documenting the unprecedented medical situation while trying desperately to keep Bella alive long enough for the baby to develop to viability. The breakthrough came when Edward heard the baby's thoughts and realized that human food was not what the hybrid needed, that the fetus required blood to sustain its vampire nature. Carlisle brought blood from the hospital, and Bella drank it through a straw, the act horrifying her, even as it strengthened both her and the baby. The birth came without warning when Bella's spine snapped completely, the catastrophic injury triggering immediate emergency that required extraction of the baby before Bella's body failed entirely. Carlisle prepared for surgery, but discovered that the amniotic sac would not cut, that no scalpel could penetrate the membrane protecting the hybrid child. Edward used his teeth to tear through the sac, lifting his daughter free, placing her briefly on Bella's chest before the hemorrhaging became unstoppable and Bella's heart began to fail. Carlisle worked frantically to control the bleeding. His centuries of surgical experience focused entirely on saving Bella's life, while Edward injected venom throughout her body, trying to spread the transformation catalyst before her heart stopped completely. Jacob Black, who had been present despite the treaty complications his presence created, performed chest compressions after Bella's heart ceased, manually circulating her blood to help distribute the venom, vampire and werewolf working together to save the woman they both loved in different ways. Carlisle continued working on her injuries, repairing what could be repaired, controlling bleeding that would otherwise prevent the transformation from taking hold. His medical expertise, the only thing standing between Bella and true death, rather than vampire transformation. Bella's transformation took 3 days, while Renesmee grew and changed at the same impossible rate she had shown in the womb, the baby developing so rapidly that she appeared weeks old within days of birth. Carlisle found himself fascinated by the hybrid child from a medical perspective, documenting everything he observed, measuring her growth and development, trying to understand the biology of something that should not exist according to everything known about vampire reproduction. But beyond the medical interest was genuine affection for this unexpected grandchild, this beautiful child who possessed Bella's eyes and Edward's features, who was aware and responsive in ways that newborn humans were not. Esme's response to Renesmee was immediate and profound, her grandmother role activating instincts that had been dormant since the loss of her human child over 80 years before. She held Renesmee with the tenderness she had never been able to show her own baby, who had died too soon, spoke to her with warmth that came from decades of suppressed maternal love finally finding outlet. The joy on Esme's face as she cared for Renesmee was something Carlisle had not seen since their early years together, before the weight of immortal existence had dimmed some of her natural warmth. Bella woke as a vampire on the 3rd day with control that shocked everyone, her ability to resist bloodlust unprecedented for a newborn, her discipline allowing her to meet her daughter without danger, despite Renesmee's appealing scent and beating heart. Carlisle examined her thoroughly, marveling at her transformation, at how the venom had healed her catastrophic injuries and remade her into vampire of extraordinary beauty and obvious power. She was family now in the fullest sense, no longer the fragile human they had protected, but true member of their coven, Edward's mate for eternity, Renesmee's mother. The family of 7 had become family of 8, the household adjusting to the presence of a hybrid child who brought joy and wonder and complications they were only beginning to understand. Carlisle and Esme found themselves in new roles as grandparents, a dimension to their relationship neither had anticipated, but both embraced with gratitude and delight. Watching Renesmee grow at her accelerated rate was bittersweet, the rapid development meaning they would not have years of her childhood, but also meaning they would see her reach maturity and stability relatively quickly. Carlisle documented everything, his medical mind cataloguing data, while his heart simply loved this impossible child who had expanded their family in ways none of them had imagined possible. And so we come to the end of Carlisle and Esme's story, though of course their story continues as long as they exist, as long as the family they built endures, as long as love persists across the centuries they have yet to live together. From two profoundly solitary beings who found each other across the chasm of death and transformation, they created something unprecedented in the vampire world. A family based not on convenience or power, but on choice and compassion and unwavering commitment to protecting human life despite their predatory nature. Their love became the foundation for everything that followed, the bedrock upon which 7 individuals built lives worth living, despite the curse of immortal existence. Without Carlisle's patience and Esme's warmth, without their partnership and their complementary natures, without his intellect and her intuition working together to guide and nurture and accept, none of the others would have found the peace and purpose they discovered within the sanctuary of the family. Edward would still be alone, Rosalie still consumed by bitterness, Emmett never saved, Alice and Jasper still wandering without true home, Bella still human and mortal, Renesmee never born into her impossible existence. The home they created was not merely physical space but emotional sanctuary, not just walls and roof, but genuine refuge from the loneliness and violence that characterized most vampire existence. Carlisle and Esme proved that vampires could choose differently, could build rather than destroy, could love rather than simply survive through the endless centuries. Their legacy extended beyond their immediate family to every vampire who learned of their existence and considered whether perhaps there might be a different way to live than the one nature demanded. Decades stretch ahead of them, centuries of continued existence together, their bond deepening with each passing year as they navigate whatever challenges immortality brings. They have weathered crises that would have destroyed lesser partnerships, have maintained their commitment to each other and to their family through transformations and conflicts and threats that tested everything they believed and everything they built. They stand together still, Carlisle and Esme, the compassionate doctor and the nurturing mother, the vampire who chose healing and the woman who chose love. Proof that even creatures designed by nature to be monsters can create something beautiful if they refuse to surrender to what they are supposed to be. And so, we leave Carlisle and Esme in their peaceful existence, surrounded by the family they built from the dying and the lost, their love enduring across centuries, their home a sanctuary in a world that would destroy them if it knew what they were. May you rest as peacefully as the family they created rests in the home they built from compassion and choice, where centuries pass like moments and love persists forever. Good night, gentle dreamers.